Stop the FOMO. Fear of missing out on HDR10 Plus? Stop the FOMO. Today, we will see for ourselves whether HDR10 Plus is worth all the hubbub, or Dolby Vision for that matter. This is Alita Battle Angel. It was shot, or the Blu-ray Ultra HD 4K has been mastered in both HDR10 Plus and Dolby Vision. And we will see for ourselves if it makes any difference at all. Maybe HDR is good enough, or plain old HDR, HDR10. We'll compare HDR10 Plus against Dolby Vision and HDR and SDR, like standard dynamic range. In other words, non-HDR. Before we move forward, I want to make sure that you guys understand what HDR brings to the table. When they developed this technology, it is with the intent to bring reality to content. The brightness is much brighter, the darks are much darker. That range, the dynamic range, is much greater than standard dynamic range, but pictures are worth 1,000 words. So you will see for yourself when I compare SDR side by side to HDR, that big difference. And folks, that is way better. Going from 4K to 8K, yeah, but going from SDR to HDR, you'll see it. Now, my question is, and as many of you are wondering, what about Dolby Vision HDR10 Plus and all this hoopla about why some TVs have it and some TVs don't? Well, let's first talk about HDR10 Plus and Dolby Vision. Both are dynamic metadata, meaning each scene is individually mastered to fit the lighting for that scene. So it changes from scene to scene. Some scenes will be a lot brighter than other scenes, and the data will reflect this change from scene to scene. Whereas HDR10, regular HDR, they set the same lighting peaks throughout the entire movie. Every scene has already been preset. It's easier, it's cheaper, and it's free. Dolby Labs realized that they could bring a bit more pop to the table if they gave content creators a way to make it scene by scene, right? Unfortunately, it costs money. Dolby Labs gets a check if you use their Dolby Vision technology. Samsung didn't like that, so they championed a license-free version called HDR10 Plus. Unfortunately, Samsung is the only TV maker in the US that has HDR10 Plus. Outside of the US, you have Panasonic, Philips. So today, you will see HDR10 Plus on the Samsung against HDR compared against SDR, right, non-HDR. But since I have a Panasonic UB820 player, I can also show Dolby Vision on the Sony A9G, and you will see how Dolby Vision and HDR10 Plus elevates HDR, if at all. So although it's not directly apples to apples, maybe it's lemons to oranges, my goal is to let you see the difference. Not necessarily, oh, Sony's better or Samsung's better. That's for another day. This is purely, is Dolby Vision better than HDR, right? So you'll see it on the Sony side, but more specifically, is HDR10 Plus better than HDR? That's harder to find. And this series of scenes that I've picked, handpicked from Alita Battle Angel, to me best demonstrates the strengths of HDR generally, and specifically, can you see a difference between 10 Plus and HDR? Or even whether 10 Plus does a better job in Dolby Vision, or Dolby Vision better than 10 Plus? Maybe they do nothing at all, right? Maybe it's all a shell game. We'll see.
So, how is HDR exactly different than SDR? Let's look at SDR to start. This is SDR, Standard Dynamic Range. we will see that HDR brings in richer colors and a bit better lighting contrast. There you go. What do you guys think? Right? It's a bit richer. This is typical of the improvements you get from HDR. Now this is just regular HDR10, static metadata. It's not 10 plus, it is not Dolby Vision, but it's still an improvement. You will now see other implementations of HDR from the streaming services. So let's get rid of SDR and add 10 plus. There you go. On the top right-hand corner, you see HDR10 plus. What does this metadata 10 plus bring to the table? What makes this dynamic? In this scene, you see an attempt to maintain quality detail while also giving you the lighting effect. In just regular HDR10 below and from the streaming service, it's a bit clipped maybe? You lose a little detail? Do we get the same improvement from HDR10 to Dolby Vision? Here we have Sony A9G doing HDR10 on the bottom, then jumping to Dolby Vision on top. Between HDR10 and the Dolby Vision above, I honestly don't see a difference. Maybe Dolby Vision didn't do anything in this scene. I guess because HDR10 looks good enough? Now this is a great scene. SDR looks pretty good. A lot of detail. This is 4K after all. But when you bring HDR to the table, bam! That is dawn breaking. Look at the subtle gradation, the morning reflection off his skin and off of the walls. Simply amazing and, more importantly, realistic. There's something to be said about a good HDR implementation. And folks, this is not even 10 plus. This is just HDR. Definitely an improvement. When they say a scene looks flat without HDR, this is that example. Now as we add HDR from the other streaming services, it looks pretty good. Yeah, the HDR10 for the Blu-ray may have a little bit more detail, but honestly, from 7 feet away, I couldn't really tell the difference. I had to stop, step up close, and take a better look. Look at HDR10 Plus on top. You see the difference? There's more detail behind that window. Yep, that's what 10 Plus gets you, a little bit more detail behind that window. Is it worth it? Yeah. Let's see if Dolby Vision brings the same improvement to HDR10. This is much harder to find. As a viewer, I do notice and appreciate the trees in the window from 10 Plus. But seriously, I don't think it's worth a format war between Dolby Vision and 10 Plus to bring us a couple extra trees through the window. The effect of the scene is still rich thanks to HDR in general. This next scene allows me to just focus on lighting effects. As you can see, it's very one note, almost monochromatic. So when you compare SDR to HDR here, you just notice better reflections. Then what does that mean? HDR brings color to the table, color depth. But if there's no color in the movie, then it really is pointless. In other words, a black and white movie probably would not benefit from HDR, even with a lot of lighting, because SDR doesn't look so bad on top. I'm using this demo to show you that SDR is not always terrible. And of course, here we have the other streaming HDR. Pretty much the same, looks good. 10 Plus, obviously, well, not even obviously, it doesn't look better at all. So in this case, without additional color detail, 10 Plus doesn't bring anything obvious to the table. Now, does Dolby Vision do anything? Let's take a look-see, but I doubt it because again, there's no color here other than monochromatic colors. And, well, yeah, the difference between 10 and Dolby Vision is not, well, it's nothing at all. I'd like to take this time to remind you that if you enjoy this kind of detailed review, please subscribe below, and I'll make sure that we continue to stop the FOMO so you don't think you're missing out on anything like HDR. This next scene demonstrates how alive HDR makes a scene. Notice the reflection off the window frame. Now, what does HDR do to that same reflection? Yeah, much better contrast. More realism, almost hyper-realistic, right? Look at how the gold color and the light reflects off of that glass. Simply put, dazzling. It truly draws your attention to that drink. Even the metal coaster looks good. And HDR does that. It makes everything pop. Does it overdo it? Does it make it look too hyper-realistic? Well, that's for you to decide, but isn't that why we go to the movies? What I don't get is, even with all the amazing thing that HDR can do with simple metadata like this, 10 Plus doesn't do anything more. I'm looking at all four, and the 10 Plus is supposed to be an improvement, and honestly, I don't see any improvement. In this scene, the HDR looks great. Obviously, it brings color depth and reflections and lighting to the table. But 10 Plus, I don't see it. And don't get me started on Dolby Vision. I think they mailed it in. They didn't even do anything. They just labeled Dolby Vision and nothing was done. My goodness, it looks identical to HDR10. But at the end of it all, my conclusion is, if you don't have 10 Plus or Dolby Vision, it doesn't really matter. If you have a good display and you have HDR, it's gonna look awesome. Here, we have 3 different TVs showing HDR. This makes more of a difference because depending on the TV you buy, your HDR experience may be different. I hope this review sheds light on what HDR brings to the table and what little HDR10 Plus or Dolby Vision brings to the table. As long as you have a TV that does HDR and your source does HDR, it's gonna look great. Don't even worry about Dolby Vision or 10 Plus. Irrelevant. Streaming in HDR sadly looked as good as Ultra Blu-ray in HDR. On a 65-inch screen from 7 feet away, I couldn't tell. So if you like this kind of review, please subscribe and you'll get a lot more.